Well, good evening, everybody. I think I can say in the name of all three of us that we are very glad you could all make it to such a gloomy topic like the end of the liberal world order as we know it while the sun is shining outside. But we'll try to be brief so we can all can get some sun afterwards. My name is Anna Sauerbrey. I'm a journalist. I run the opinion pages at the Tagesspiegel here in Berlin, and I also write a column on Germany for the New York Times. And to my right is Michael Zürn. He's the director of the research unit Global Governance here at the WZB and a professor of international relations at the Freie Universität of Berlin. And to my left is Jan Zielonka, professor of European politics at the University of Oxford, and he's a Ralph Dahrendorf professor, professorial fellow at St. Anthony's College, and this plays a major role in his book too, which is written as a letter to his teacher and friend Ralph Dahrendorf. We will start with two book presentations. Jan Zielonka will present Michael Zürn's book and vice versa. For each will take about 15 minutes, and then we will discuss both books here on the panel and, of course, open it up to your questions afterwards. Well, would you like to start presenting the book?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm delighted to be here after, I think, many years, nearly a decade. And what the occasion. We have here opportunity to discuss, in particular, Michael's book, which is basically about world politics. Michael develops a very comprehensive and highly original conceptual framework for thinking about global governance. And the focus is, and you have leaflets there, you can see what it's all about, and you can also get the book outside. And the focus is basically authority, legitimacy, and contestation, basically the key topic in all political science. And this is a very rewarding meal, so to speak, both theoretically and empirically. You know, I was thinking that reading this book is like eating in a slow food restaurant. You know, those from Italy know what slow food is. I see here Christian Jorgens and Tanja Borzel. They spent a lot of time in Italy and they know what is the difference between slow food and bistro food. My book is like a bistro food, you know. You basically get a simple food and you can only enjoy when you have a lot of wine with it. Michael's book is a serious cooking, yeah. It's a slow of a time with greatest care and reaching highest level of delight when tested. His book suggests that the world politics is now embedded in a normative and institutional structure dominated by hierarchies and power inequalities or asymmetries. It therefore creates contestation, resistance, and distributional struggles. Michael identified conditions under which struggles in global governance system lead to decline and deepening. And this is probably what I find the most important and exciting in his book. You know, this book, if you look even on the cover of them and titles, they look like from different planets. But in a way, we have a lot in common. We both believe that unreformed governance systems prompt counter-institutionalizations, as he called it, or counter-revolution, as I call it. These will not necessarily result in improvements, but these are natural, very natural reactions to institutional paralysis, complacency, and sense of injustice. Both, therefore, Michael and I believe that politicization of international institutions is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a natural thing. public authorities ought to be legitimized in one way or another. How to do this is more tricky, of course. Because actors concerned need to feel part of the project. They need to believe that those institutions work for them, and that institutional hierarchies do not generate inequalities and injustice. We also, when we talk about actors, we don't look only at states. We look also at international, regional organizations, cities, regions, NGOs, citizens, and even firms to play their part in global politics, and increasingly so. Yeah? That is very important among students of international relations to emphasize it time and again. Yeah? And we both believe that transnational transactions require what? Transnational public authorities. That the public authorities have to operate on the same level as transactions, either financial, communicative, and others. Yeah? And in a system of fuzzy borders, if not open borders, you can hardly apply the Westphalian solutions to governance. It doesn't work even within the EU, and it certainly will not work in a global setting. I have to say that both Michael and I have we both like synthetic, catchy phrases. I give you one, my favorite one of Michael. Now, he wrote at a certain moment, counter-institutionalization by rising powers aims at voice, not at exit or loyalty. I think it's a beautiful rephrasing of Hirschman. And we both are very fond of Thomas Kuhn and his notions of paradigms. You know, NGOs or media always call for leadership, or for more resources to be put on this and that, but you know, we are both skeptical of leaders who have no sense of direction, however charismatic they are. And if there are always easy ways to waste money if you don't have a paradigm how to invest them. So we need paradigms. And we are both actually working for years in this manufacturing of paradigms. I think I priced him enough. You now wait for disagreements, right? Otherwise it would be totally predictable. Disagreements are here difficult because I'm basically very much on the same page. Where I would say something, it would be these spaces he doesn't go, or the issues he could say in a bolder way, more forcefully. I understand that if you are German head professor, you have to be careful with bold statements, but sometimes a little bit boldness pays off. I give you two examples. Michael's book about he spends a lot of time to define what is this counter-institutionalization, which is basically systemic change. But when I read about the scope and nature of the systemic change, I have a feeling that he talks about the late 20th century and not the beginning of the 21st century. Why? Because he somehow trusts very much incremental change, which is peaceful and very much under control, orchestrated or engineered in a rational way. Well, I think this was the case, but in a very short period of history, maybe after the fall of Berlin Wall 2001. I think that this century is about different qualities. And I'm not shy to say it is largely about chaos and turbulence. And this is why the notions of revolution or counter-revolutions are so important. Global governance, the whole concept of global governance, assumes a certain degree of global order. But are they available at present? You know, it's enough to read her newspaper. It's full of reports of conflicts, confusion, insecurity, unrest. And global institutions, what they are? They are today global helpless bystanders. Where was the United Nations during last week bombing of Syria? They resemble facade or zombie institutions, which exist on paper but are powerless or unable to perform their functions. And I know what you will tell me. Chaos and order are relative terms, yeah? Particularly here in Berlin. It seems everything going well. And you know, but I think it's, if you look historically, and I see some great historians here in the room, I think we are experiencing a different setting than before. And in a way, theory of international relations is not very good to deal with chaos and disorder. I always say we don't have a theory of absurdity. And even the concept of anarchy, you know, assumes, you know, certain order. States are equal and sovereign. They are supposed not to intervene in each other first. This is pretty predictable if it would work ever, yeah? And my point here is, and don't worry, I'm coming to my second and last point, but my point here is not that international laws and rules are being ignored. They always have been ignored and violated. Today, the problem seems to me that we are living in a world where no rules seem to apply any longer. Seem not to apply any longer. This is partly because powerful non-state actors, from, say, ISIS to Facebook, couldn't care less about the rules created by states. But this is also because the states which created those rules basically ignore them. They don't play along those rules. You know, think about nearly every day there is a drone attack which is arbitrary, unauthorized by law, and basically illegal, either the Middle East or Afghanistan. Cyber attacks are notorious. Interference in domestic affairs, order of the day. These are not just pathologies of the dysfunctional system of governments. This is a new normal. This is what it is. An international institution, can they do something about this? We talk with practitioners. They are really at loss. And I would go even a step further. And I would suggest that we are already in the state of war. We are already in the state of war, not just disorder. However, it is a hybrid war. Hybrid war. Well, what is hybrid war? Italians would call it né carne né pesce, you know. you don't have vocabulary to describe it. Hmm? You don't know what it is, really. Unidentified phenomenon. But if we look at the fusion of terrorism, civil wars, trade wars, cyber wars, and ordinary military expedition in so-called failed states, yeah? Can we claim that we still live in a relative peace? And even in the most advanced Western democracies, you know, the extraordinary warlike rules are being introduced on a daily basis. I mean, in France, we still have a state of emergency. In Spain, we have a state of emergency in Catalonia, but not only that. I mean, I just read, you know, that under the law of 2015 in Spain, which broadened the definitions of terrorism in response to jihadist, threat in Europe, 66 people have been convicted under this law, according to Amnesty International, and they mostly include who? Musicians, filmmakers, and journalists, fined for lyrics or posts on social media. Eh? This is not Turkey. This is Spain. In Hungary and Austria, in the US, the military is patrolling the border. I mean, last year, we're talking about Albach. I was driving from Florence to Austrian Alps, and Austrian decided to send military vehicles to control, to check whether they are not illegal migrants. There were usually thousands of them, 20 kilometers far of Germans coming back from holidays from Italy. They kept them for hours. Later they announced that they found 3 illegal migrants somewhere on the train. This is a new normal. And you had the same experience with Denmark, right? I'm not even talking about detention applied, particular provisional detentions applied not just to suspected terrorists, but suspected whistleblowers. And threats are also hybrid. And I have no time to go about this, but this implies that we don't only fear distractions, we fear more disruption. Because cyber attack will knock out our hospitals, our fire brigades, our banks. This is a new normal. And the fear is diffuse, unattached, unclear, and people are getting hysterical and they look for scapegoats. The scapegoats are not just migrants, scapegoats are also liberal politicians these days. Although still, they are not locked into detention camps, so there's a difference. At least not yet. So, in this context, I think we have to look at international order or global governments differently, because this is not just contestation. This is a powerful tsunami, or I should say avalanche, because largely man-made. And this brings me to the last point. How can we talk about global governance, in the midst of this hybrid war? Who is providing a minimum prerequisite of governance? Is it Trump? Is it Juncker? Is it Xi? I'm not even talking about the nice chap, General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. I wanted to say something more about non-state actors, because they play a very important role in Michael's book, but I maybe raise those issues in the discussion. But what I wanted to say to you, that when you read Michael's books, you understand the present in a longer perspective, and not through the snapshot provided by social media and old media, but through a very rigorous analysis over 40 years or so. And therefore, this book is a delight to read, you know, even on a sunny day like today.
Thank you, Jan. You may easily imagine that I would have now a strong tendency to respond directly to those challenges. But since I wrote and I write about rule and about rules, I stick with the rules. And what I do now is present first my view of the book Counter-Revolution and point to some of the strengths, and then also raise two issues where I would like to go a little bit deeper and discuss a little bit more about. Before that, I mean, Jan in his presentation had a part where he pointed to commonalities of the two books. I also found one. I mean, I found many, but one that I want to mention. In a sense, I think both books struggle with something, and they struggle essentially with a situation in which there is a certain sense that the liberals and cosmopolitans, and both of us admit that we belong to this strange group, that they have the difficult situation that they have to defend something what they want to change, that they need to change something in order to defend it. This sort of double challenge that all the liberal institutions, the cosmopolitan institutions are confronted with, that in order to defend them, they need to be changed, and that is a sort of a communicative, discursive problem. That is something that I read very much also into this book, and I think there is a commonality with this sort of challenge, that it does not suffice to say now, well, we want to defend now those liberal institutions against those bad guys, against the authoritarian populists. We need to defend them against those, but at the same time, they need to be changed in order to be defensible. And that is a sort of a dilemma in which I think we currently are. Jan Zielonka emphasizes in his book Counter-Revolution essentially a set of issues that are targeted by authoritarian populists, if you may label them this way. And essentially, it is three issues that are targeted by populists. It's on the one hand, the EU as a whole, as he points out, it's constitutional liberalism, and it is neoliberal economic policies. These are essentially the targets of those criticism, as it is really carved out very clearly and beautifully in this extremely well-written book. And I can promise you, I mean, slow food, fast food, that doesn't fit the description. This is a joy to read, and if you want to read my book, you have to work a little bit. So in that sense, I think that's a more appropriate description of this difference. But the most important part of Jan's book is essentially he identifies 8 streams of problematic developments in the last 2 decades. And I want to group them essentially in 4 larger issues that are targeted and where you essentially point to bad, problematic, wrong developments in Western societies in the last 2 decades. The first one is the economic side of it. There's a deepening of capitalism, a deepening of commodification, one may say a neoliberal revolution, and neoliberal economic policies that led to a crisis, and the crisis essentially led to a situation that the crisis management turned out to be a socialism for the rich, that the rich ones essentially got rescued while the rest of the society has essentially to pay the bill. In that sense, growing inequality is the result, and that's one of the very fundamental maldevelopments that he points to. A second one is the whole issue of post-truth, fake news, the emphasis on the relativity of knowledge also in academia, and essentially the ensuing epistemic crisis. We do not know anymore what is true, and this is used by many political forces in order even to make obviously untrue things true. In that sense, there's a sort of a deeper epistemic crisis that has clearly become more visible in the last 2 decades, also carved out very beautifully. There's thirdly, a democratic malaise, that is the term that you use, a crisis of democracy, a decline in voter turnout, and many people talk about post-democracy. So the political crisis of Western democracy that he points to. He also points to that the 1990 situation was abused in a sense, that there was a geopolitics by the few, as Jan labels it, essentially dominance of the EU in essentially exporting the Western model to societies in Eastern Europe, essentially a maldevelopment that he points to, and of course finally the crisis of migration, a lack of control of borders, and of course a lack of the capability to integrate those people. I think these 5 developments capture, of course, very, very nicely what happened in the last 2 decades and what essentially led to a sort of a crisis and the situation that we write now, books like this, and that we think about the future of the liberal order, as you have put it early on. Jan does not stop here. He puts forward essentially 3 proposals, what needs to be changed and how to think things in a new way. And he, first of all, points to something that in this form, in this version, I have not read very often, which is a very interesting point. It essentially says, well, we need the EU, but we do not need an EU of the nations. We do not need an EU of the states. We need an EU of the cities. We need an EU of NGOs. We need essentially a strengthening of those non-state actors in the EU, and he points strongly to the role of local actors to cities in this context. He advocates experimental governance. That is essentially all forms of political representations, of political participation that go beyond the regular use of parliaments, and that goes beyond regular elections. It's a sort of an openness always to try out new things, but then being able to respond very quickly to failures and a strong way of really experimenting always with what kind of policies work and how new forms of participation can be created. And as part of that, a third proposal that I saw is the whole notion of using digital networks for deliberation, something like e-deliberation, as you label it. So these are the suggestions, how to handle those kind of maldevelopments. And let me just say, I agree with many arguments and criticisms put forward in this book. I think it is really a great and very enlightening book, full of great lines. I wrote down at least 10 or 15 wonderful citations, and it's extremely well written. And I mean, since he is not a native English speaker as little as I am, I think this is even more impressive to read such a wonderfully written book from someone like Jan. I have 2 questions that I want to raise, and 2, if you want to label it this way, 2 criticisms. The first is the whole term counter-revolution. I think it speaks to some extent already to the criticism that he put forward. And the question, of course, is, have we already experienced something like counter-revolution, or are we in midst of a counter-revolution? And why this very strong term, counter-revolution? I mean, usually revolution is defined as a fundamental and permanent structural change in a political system. I just used a dictionary in order found a definition of revolution, not of counter-revolution, but of revolution. Fundamental and permanent structural change in a political system. And I do not deny that this may be the goal of some of the authoritarian forces, to create a fundamental and permanent structural change in our political systems. However, I wonder a little bit about something that he points out quite often, that all of those authoritarian populist forces seem to be very much negative forces. They have very strong ideas what they do not want to have. They have very small ideas what they want to have. I mean, that is something that he points out very strongly. But then again, I mean, is not revolution a term that we usually use when there are groups who want to change something and they want to know how to change it. They want to have something new. In that sense, revolution is a very strong term. And also the term indicates to some extent that the revolution has already taken place. And if you have listened to him about the developments on the global scale, he seems to believe strongly in that all the challenges, all the contestations are not any more contestations. They have already created chaos, turbulence, and the absence of rule. And here, let me speak as a German. I mean, as a German, I have problems to see the revolution. Merkel still governs. Many would say she still governs the same way than 16 years ago. The EU has not changed very much. In my view, it has changed much too little. And on the global level, I see also contestations of the system. But many indicators that we also use and develop here essentially do not point to a breakdown of the system, at least not as long as Donald Trump was elected. So there are, I think we can raise doubts about the question whether we have seen already a counter-revolution. And that's something that I indeed want to ask you. I agree, of course, if you look at this from a Polish perspective. In Poland, we have very fundamental changes. I still would say in Poland, we are in midst of a struggle about the future political development. But if you go, for example, to Hungary or probably also to Turkey, one could argue there the counter-revolution has taken place already. But is it true for all of Western Europe? Is it true for the global system, as you partially point out? Is it really right to say that we have already seen such a counter-revolution? No question. I do not deny that there's a crisis of the liberal and democratic order, but my point would be there's an ongoing struggle, and we need to understand the struggle, and we need to understand essentially the type of contestation, why this contestation happened, and what is the normativity behind this contestation in order to defend something that we believe is to be defended. My second question that I want to raise is about the relationship between the proposals for change, your recommendations for new policies, and the sort of problematic developments that you wonderfully identified. Clearly, the book is, one may label it, a political essay. And in that sense, it shies away from establishing a causal link between the maldevelopments and the rise of authoritarian forces. This is fair and maybe a very wise self-limitation. But my question nevertheless remains, do the proposals that you have in mind really address the causes of the counter-revolution? Would they help to avoid this counter-revolution? One, I just repeat, I mean, there's the idea of more experimental governance, there's the idea of a stronger role for non-state actors in the EU, and there's the idea of e-deliberation. All focus essentially, and that would be my first question mark in that respect, essentially on the political causes of the crisis. And they are all proposals that suggest to change the political system. But that leaves, of course, completely open the sort of economic and cultural causes of the counter-revolution. And many people, I mean, I just think about a quite recent working paper by Engelhardt and Norris, they essentially argue it is those two things, inequality and the cultural change that has caused authoritarian populism. They do not talk very much about political causes, but your proposals only point to the political level. Let me add that in the work that I do here with Ruud Koopmans and Wolfgang Merkel, we also point very much to some of those political causes of authoritarian forces. So I think this is important, but the question is, does it suffice to struggle against those authoritarian populists only by having political reforms? Is it not necessary also to have economic reforms and maybe also another form of cultural exchange? So we need to add this, but the question is, does it suffice? The second issue that I would like to ask you and that I would like to raise here is, if you look to the type of proposal for political change, they point into a certain direction. And they point into the direction essentially of making expertise even more stronger in the political process. If you have more e-deliberation, as we all know, e-deliberation cannot be exercised by anyone. If we talk about experimental governance, this of course means we do not increase the participation. And if we essentially put away the power from the parliament and the governments in the EU and give it in the hand of the cities, it would be even more hard to understand how the political system works. My question here is that this sense of being excluded, which is, I think, authentic on the side of many of those who support authoritarian populists, has something to do with this sense of a feeling of being politically excluded. It is a sense that all those majoritarian institutions that were for a long time decisive for democracies, that is parliaments and parties, that they have lost significance, and that they have lost significance to non-majoritarian institutions like central banks, like courts, like international institutions and European institutions. And all the measures that Jan suggests essentially go into the direction of even making those non-parliamentary, non-majoritarian institutions even stronger. And therefore the question is, wouldn't you produce in the end just a further strengthening of the counter-revolutionary forces, if you want to have it this way? Well, I mean, let me just come back to my starting point by pointing to my favorite line in the book. It says, liberals have proved to be better at finger-pointing than at self-reflection. I think that is a wonderful observation. And one may add, most intellectuals have been better at finger-pointing than at defending normative achievements. Yet in order to withstand the counter-revolution, we have to do both. We have to do a sort of a normative reconstruction of what we have and what we want to defend, and we need to criticize it in order to be able to change it. Jan, in his long letter to Lord Dorndorf, emphasized the critique, and I think this is a really great contribution. Thanks for having written this wonderful book. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you both. Luckily, there's a lot to disagree on, so this is going to be an interesting discussion. I think like one of the main points, and maybe we can start with that, is how bad is the situation really? Are we in a situation that we need to term a revolution? Is this the change of an era, the change of an era that has already taken place? Are we living in a new era? Or are we just seeing maybe a phase or a hiccup in the system, so to speak? So what makes you more optimistic? Because you, in your book, you're saying that it could play out both ways. It could lead either to the deepening or to the decline of international organizations.
Well, I mean, what I do see is clearly an ongoing struggle in the world. We see a fundamental attack to some of the liberal values. But what we also see is a sort of a a change of the political landscape. We have very strongly the rise of a cleavage between, let's say, those who are for open borders, those who are for individual rights, those who are for international institutions, against those who are for the will of majority, who are for closed borders, and who are for national sovereignty. This sort of cleavage is very strongly determining the debates, and the outcome of this cleavage seems to me an open struggle. And in some countries, like Germany, we still have a 3/3 majority for those who are in favor of an open society. In other societies, this is different. In that sense, I think we are talking about an ongoing struggle with a very open end, and it seems to me too fast to say we have lost already. It's already over. We have only chaos and we have only turbulence. We are still living in a society in which the rule of law plays a certain role, in which we have democratic elections. And the same seems to me true to the international level. We have many challenges, but most of the challenges, and maybe Trump indeed is the exception, not China, and not many of the other rising powers. It's Trump and to some extent Putin, who essentially try to establish a sort of justification for their policies which says America first. We don't have global goals. We don't have global values. We don't have global collective goods. I mean, that is the new thing about Trump. And in that sense, you are right. This is the most fundamental challenge that is currently going on. But then, I mean, we have all learned that we underestimated Mr. Trump significantly, and that has been a huge mistake. But then, of course, we should not overestimate him. I mean, he still has to win his battle, and I think a lot depends on how we, the other side, responds to it. In that sense, I would say it's an open question. It's a struggle, and as all struggles, it is open who wins.
And could you maybe say something about the concrete examples that Jan Zielonka mentioned? He was very critical of the role the UN are currently playing in the Syria crisis. He also spoke of the demise of the European Union. You could also name the World Trade Organization that's challenged by a maybe beginning trade war. Where do you see those institutions right now?
When I listened to Jan, I thought I probably have mislabeled the title of my book, because he said there is no global governance, there's only chaos and disorder, and in that sense there is no order, there is no governance, so it would be a theory about nothing, right? and I would say, I mean, look, if African countries are pressed by the rules of the World Trade Organization to pay money for medicaments which used essentially their own resources in order to develop those medicaments. These are normative orders which press them to pay money. If the Greeks feel essentially that rating agencies to a significant extent dictate their economic policy against their will, it's also not force and coercion, not chaos, it's rules. The whole idea behind the theory of global governance is that we should forget the notion that global governance is something nice, something consensual, something where everyone agrees, something technocratic. It has become political. It is by now a struggle between different sides, and global governance means rule and rules. It means domination. It means inequality. And because we have global governance, we have more struggles about global governance. I mean, in one line, I would say it is because we have the rise of international authorities in the 1990s, because we have now, why we have now the struggle about those authorities.
Do you want to answer the question now? Shall we take questions later on?
We take questions.
We get back to the question after the discussion.
Questions later on, and I will take it up. Let me just say 2 words, and then I think we should pass on. to Jan.
Okay, we'll get to that in a minute, and then we can get back to your question in the discussion.
We both have wrong titles, but
Yeah.
let me just say, I mean, this one word. There's no question the global and the world is very pluralistic. But of course, all national societies are pluralistic as well. And there are conflicts and there's chaos within societies. And many of the examples that Jan pointed to, the Catalan independence movement, the Austrian migration policy. I mean, these are policies that take place within nation states. We have also conflict within nation states. So the fact that we have conflicts, the fact that we have many different views on different things is typical for politics. It's not typical for the global political system, and that is something that we should take into account. That it is true, there are different notions of global governance, but it is also true there are different notions of national governance. In that sense, the fact that we have different notions about something does not exclude that we talk about global governance.
So what makes you so sure this is a new era? I mean, some scientists who have looked at the development of populist parties in Europe for a couple of decades say, well, we've seen waves of populist parties rising before, and then they declined again, and maybe this is just another wave, and we will see just another decline when the European societies have digested the migration crisis. So what are the indications that make you feel it's really something new we are witnessing?
No, my comment to your question will be, if it is so good, why it is so bad? You know, you see, of course, we don't have, you know, this is a very strange revolution, counter-revolutions. We don't have, you know, mass of people building barricades on the streets and you know, constructing guillotines or so. It is all through the ballot box. You can say, as after Simon Jenkins, a British columnist, when he said the most appropriate synonym to populists is that they are popular, because they are winning elections. That's the point. They are winning elections. They do it through the ballot box. And they are doing this in more and more countries. I just came from Italy, when I spent 2 months in electoral periods, and who has won? Salvini and Grillo, Lega Nord and Cinque Stelle. There's a totally different variation of anti-liberalism. But there's no doubt. And who has lost terribly? Renzi, Partito Democratico, and Berlusconi, Forza Italia. Established right-wing, center-left, center-right parties. And I remember when Renzi came to power a few years ago, he was hailed like today Macron is being hailed, yeah? He defeated populists. Now we got social democrats basically looking like Christian Democrats and being at the same time modern and tweeting and, you know, and basically new quality. And what has happened in those few years? I've seen that those politicians, anti-liberal politicians, could be defeated. But when this succeeded, when the politicians from the establishment adopted basically most of their agenda. This has happened in Holland. I happen to be Dutch citizen, so I follow Dutch politics quite closely, where Rutte, by the way, from formerly liberal party, you know, adopted a lot of language and took votes from Mr. Wilders, yeah, on migrants. I've seen this in Austria. Mr. Wurz, we were so happy, we as liberals, we won elections for president of Austria. And who is governing today, Austria? Coalition? And you can say, it's not the end of the day.
No, because they've governed before,
Yeah.
and then they declined.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we
But
had a
I see
great
it
coalition for a
everywhere.
decade.
And here, the point is that anti-liberal movement is not just on the right, it's also on the left. There are local variations. I compare in my book, and a lot of people would object to this, Mr. Kaczynski from Poland, Mr. Tsipras in Greece. You know, one hates Russia, the other loves Russia. One is against all migrants, the other wants to treat migrants decently. They're totally different, right? One is former communist, the other is nationalist. But they have one thing in common. They both are against the principle of liberal order. And here where it comes titled counter-revolution. I mean, we can debate, particularly in academic places, for months, definitions. But for me, when I looked for the term, it was pretty simple. I tried to understand what has happened with the dream I'd grown up, and which was described by Darren Dovies' book, Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, which was written after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we all thought, this is a new word. We all thought, now there will be no walls. Now Europe is united. Now there will be justice with growth together. I all believed it. This was the dream came true. I fought for this. I fled my country for this. Left everything with $50 from my mother. And now, 3 decades later, I see it's all falling apart. So I call it counter-revolutions. But of course, counter-revolutions usually want restoration. I don't think they really want restoration, although some of them are rely heavily on old national ideas. But I don't think this is just destruction. They know what they don't want. And I don't even expect from them to have a solution. I expected from us to have solutions, but we don't. And here I say the last thing. You see, I never thought they are so strong. I still believe they are so strong because we are so weak. Because we said one thing, have done another. Because we betrayed all of those ideas which we had on our banners. And we lost, and in many countries we lost the electorate. And I'm the last one who would say that democracy is only about elections, but you cannot have democracy without elections either. But what I heard in Poland when they lost elections, that the electorate got mad. What I heard in America when Clinton lost elections. These people, basically don't understand what is worried about. Is it the way to regain trust of the electorate? It is not, and therefore I'm pessimistic, because I don't see us actually regaining trust of electorate, because we don't have, first of all, we haven't acknowledged our mistakes. Second, we just don't have things to say about running markets, democracy, and international relations in a way which would be sufficiently credible. So I basically came to conclusions that this is so bad because we've made a lot of mistakes. We screwed it.
Maybe that's a good point, because you both, in very different ways, say that liberalism itself is one of the sources of the demise or the decline of the liberal order. Could you be a little more precise? What exactly are you reproaching liberals with? I mean, you have a chapter in your book why they hate liberals.
They were not populists in power when inequalities were basically growing, and they were not just tolerated but encouraged. Yeah. By the way, globalization didn't fall from the sky. Didn't come from China either. These were liberals, us, privatizing, deregulating everything. Yeah. And depriving public authorities possibilities to have influence on markets. And you cannot have democracy unless you have some public authorities regulating markets, because you can promise in elections many things, but you cannot implement them. To my knowledge, the last politicians in the West who tried to challenge the market was Mitterrand, and he was smashed after a few months, and he said, thank you very much. And Blair took a notice and basically said, you cannot beat them, you join them. So these were also not populists in power, where we were bombing other countries without UN mandate and then leaving them to rot, in the hands of local warlords. These were not populists in power who were paying North African warlords to keep refugees not coming to our countries, yeah? And when the Arab Spring arrived, we were embarrassed because we, of course, were on the wrong side. And so on and so on. I can go, the list is long. And we have to acknowledge this.
So how about the international system? What are the flaws built into the system by liberals that now may damage it?
Yes, I mean, I'm fully in line with Jan, that it is features, decisions, policies that were established in the 1990s by liberal forces, which essentially created the sort of resistance that we currently see. And on the domestic level, I would add what you implicitly mentioned, that there is a sense of political exclusion, that many of the people on the street, in quotation marks, do feel that they have less influence on decisions than maybe 2 or 3 decades ago. On the international level, I think Jan pointed to one, essentially the fact that I would say the most fundamental principle of all legitimacy is that alike cases are treated alike. That is probably the most fundamental principle before we consider sort of an authority as legitimate. I mean, you only have to look at kids. They accept if you are not democratic. But the moment when you essentially react to two sisters in a different way for the same action, then there's a huge amount of resistance. And I think it's obvious that in many cases, international institutions that exercise rule, that exercise authority, have responded differently to different types of actors. They have not treated alike cases alike. And I think all the UN interventions are the prime example of that. They have intervened when it was in the interest of the intervening powers, and there were some humanitarian violations, but they have not intervened in many cases when there were violations of international law as well, and there was no intervention. In that sense, alike cases are not treated alike, and many of the even stated forms of resistance in the Middle East have exactly to do with that. I mean, the difference, how the Western world has handled Arab powers and has handled Israel, is one of the reasons for this wild form of resistance. The second one I would mention for the international level is that those international institutions that I talk about have gained authority in the last 25 years. There's a sort of challenge now of this authority in the last years, but they have gained it. And it's now not only that all states agree that we do something together, there's the possibility for international institutions to make decisions against the will of at least some states and some societies. And they are very intrusive. And for doing this, for having this strong and intrusive form of authority, there has to be certain types of legitimation. And the purely technocratic legitimation that those institutions essentially put forward does not suffice for some of those measures. If the IMF essentially pushes for austerity policies in some countries, this is not a form of policy that can be legitimated only referring to technocracy, only referring to economic experts. You need to have some form of participation to have this kind of policy. So this would be the second one. However, I mean, if I may add so, still, they are there, those international institutions. And of course, there are some countries where populists have won the election. I know this and I agree. But then again, I mean, are you not essentially repeating the Fukuyama mistake now by saying, I mean, when Fukuyama said in 1990, now everything becomes liberal and beautiful, now there's a little, I mean, I put it now starkly, there's a little resistance, and now you say everything breaks down, and we will see the counter-revolution and the dominance of populism for the next 50 years. This is what I do not believe. I think democracies are stronger than you. I mean, democracies made a lot of mistakes, but democracies are stronger that they just fell down now because of some elections where right-wing populists win. I mean, you sound a little bit to me like the conservative intellectual in the 1920s who saw the Russian Revolution and states, well, now we have a worldwide revolution and socialism will win for the rest of the century. And as we know, they didn't win.
I think this needs a reply. What distinguishes you from a conservative of the 1920s?
I never said that they are going to win. Otherwise, I wouldn't try to put the message through. But complacency and self-assurance bordering with arrogance brought us to the situations we are now. These things didn't happen over time. The electorate was very patient for a long time. And now it's very difficult to regain their trust. And here is the point which is key in my book. Because we can focus on individual fields of international, of diplomacy, on economics, on media. But the essence was, and this is what I say in this book, and you can say, well, it's with Fukuyama, but I think on this he was right. That the liberals were able to define the notion of normality. Liberalism has become ideology of power, which would tell you what is wrong and what is good, what is rational, what is crazy. And it didn't only concern, for instance, economic policies, yeah? That deregulation, privatization is the only game in town. It concerned very simple, also the way we dress, we talk, we look at multicultural society. And I cite in this book these beautiful quotations of this former Polish from Peace, you know, a foreign minister when he bashes, by the way, in the interview with Die Welt, not only those who are against religions and against nations, but also those riding bicycles and being ecologists, if not vegans, yeah? And in Poland, by the way, for your information, the greatest object of assault is genderism. So it is not just about economics. It is about the notions of normality. It is the package, ideological package. And this is the challenge, because you see, it is then not enough to change policy in one field and expect that you get rid of this. And I've seen it in Italy. Minniti, the minister for responsible for immigration, was praised by Salvini from Lega Nord, because he, of course, was, all making deals with the Libyan authorities, whatever those authorities are there, yeah? To keep those migrants, not allowing them to go on any boats, keeping them in concentration camps, basically deporting people as much as he could. And it didn't work, because they thought this is all about migration. So let's be tough on migration, it will work. It didn't work. It is about everything. And that is the challenge. Because liberalism become an all-encompassing way of understanding who we are and what is the best way to do. And when this goes down, that is very difficult to challenge it, to maintain this. It's very difficult. Am I pessimist or optimist? No, of course I'm optimist. Because, you know, I spend most of my time trying to tell to my liberal friends, get your acts together, acknowledge your mistakes, try to come with alternatives for the electorate, and don't tell them that they are stupid and uneducated, yeah? Because, you know, don't go particularly to Brussels to complain about populists, but go to your villages and complain those who will tomorrow vote in the elections. But it doesn't work this way. And I don't see the pendulum changing. And I'm not fatalist here, and only historians will tell us who was right or who was wrong 100 years from now. But I think it will take some time, and partly, not only because I don't see in those countries where the left or the center-right lost to anti-liberal movements that they are really bouncing back. But what is the worst? I believe we don't have plausible, all-encompassing proposal for people to believe in. We lack, you know, Piketty knows everything about inequality. But this is only about inequality. He doesn't know how to generate growth. He doesn't know how European integration works. He doesn't know most of the things. And you can go from one to we lack equivalent of John Smith or Karl Marx in economics. And the same applies to democracy. But as I said, for me, the major problem with democracy is that it lost control of the market, not institutional. We can have all the new institutions, but if they cannot deliver on promises because decisions are being made somewhere else doesn't help. But even in these things which Michael criticized me, maybe rightly, I cannot understand how it is that last 3 decades was all about internet. And business and other bodies introduce internet, and internet is still to be discovered by democratic institutions. And the only people who use the internet, you know, in democratic devices are those anti-liberals, like from the left, Podemos or Cinque Stelle. I don't understand this. How is it possible? So there is something there, yeah? But you see, because when I say about democracy, I try to always to say that more and more decisions were shifted to bodies who were not elected. Central banks, constitutional courts, European Commission, regulatory agencies. Well, maybe and the only way in which politicians were using, you know, internet was for polling, like for the supermarket, to try to see what kind of soap people want to buy. That is not the way to regain trust of the electorate.
I think what I'd like to distinguish, or what I'd like you both to elaborate on, is, are we really having an ideological crisis, or are we having a crisis caused by the effects that liberalism has produced? What I like about your book is that in your concept of reflexive authority, you distinguish between the two. As you just said in the example with the children, children are buying authority as long as they deem the outcome just. And it doesn't, even if maybe the internal mechanism in the family or in the international institution may lack some legitimation, formal legitimation, the outcome may still be respected. So is really like the idea of liberalism challenged, or is it just because it produces bad outcomes because it is married to neoliberalism and other concepts?
I think it is both. I think there are, of course, outcomes that have been produced, especially by the strong adoption of neoliberal policies, that we have a level of inequality and a level of impossibility to have only the chance to have a better life in 5 or 10 years in many parts of the Western world, where we have youth unemployment rates of 60 or 70%. That means that half of a generation is essentially out of the market. So I mean that is the result, to some extent at least, of neoliberal policies. Not only, but also to some extent. But I would agree. Yes, it is true that we are in a sort of an ideological struggle, and that things have changed. That there are some of the things that we would consider as liberal normalcy that are contested by now, and I think that has to do to some extent with the internal tensions of Tanja Pürzel is also here of the liberal script. That, for example, the liberal script, of course, says there is individual freedom to move. On the other hand, when we have poverty in Africa and millions move, that is something that challenges the whole notion of a liberal society and of a liberal state. So it is an internal tension of the script to some extent, that this individual right to move collapses with the right of a community to determine their own borders. And I think there are others tension like that, this idea that we want to have growth, that we increasingly want to get rich, that there is progress, but then there is the whole idea of sustainability. And these kind of internal tensions, they have essentially produced, given the technological developments, given the enormous scope that any decision has in the days of globalization, have made all those things much more visible, that there are problems coming with liberalism. And that has led to a sort of an ideological struggle, mainly about those issues that I mentioned before, open versus closed borders. Are we willing to give away political authority to institutions beyond the nation state? And do we go with the will of the majority, or do we essentially accept rights of individuals and of minorities?
I think that's an important point, because you mentioned that in your book too, and you haven't mentioned it here tonight, but that liberals haven't paid enough attention to the longing for community. Could you maybe elaborate on that? And I think you also have a very interesting term in your book, sort of a way out, the funding of a communitarian republic. So is that part of the problem? And can liberalism and more community-based ideologies be married, and how?
Before you think that I'm total extremist, I want to tell you that I basically, like Dahrendorf, try to see, or like Berlin in a way, to see various norms which are noble by themselves, but they are somehow in conflict sometimes. So what has happened is not that liberals betrayed equality and only endorse freedom, although it is the irony of history why two liberal professors from LSE, Popper and Hayek, why Hayek shaped history much more than Popper. It's the irony of history that Popper was adopted by people like Soros or so, but Hayek really conquered Thatcher and Reagan. And here the same, liberals somehow neglected the balance between individuals and community. And liberals were always at pain talking about communities, because those communities, these are nationalists, these are people who are primordial, individuals, for them were more important. But people live in communities. They have feeling of belonging. They live in certain territory. And they want to, the issue of trust is very important for them. And informal institutions, which political scientists do not study, and which are extremely important, informal institutions are very much of those belonging and not what formal institutions are structured in impersonal links and certain rules. So what I want to say is that the balance has tipped, and it has to be, and this is my main solution for improvement, that we have to come to a different balance between freedom and equality, between individual rights and between collective ones, and between public and private sphere. I'm the last one who would say that the state, and planning economy will do wonders. I grown up in communist Poland. I can tell you how badly it was. But we went to another extremes, I always joke that, I was not fooled by communist propaganda. Why would I be by neoliberal one? Yeah? Because these are those extremes. We stopped balancing, and this was the major liberal principle. Liberal principle was not about building utopia, and therefore we are so weak as liberals of giving very simple institutional solutions. These are populists who have simple solutions for complex problems. Berlusconi, in March, before election, was going from studio to studio saying, flat tax will solve everything, yeah? Look at Singapore, look at Putin, perfect, yeah? Happily, Italians didn't believe this. But you see, no. Liberal is basically about try and error. Process is more important than the product. Deliberation, bargaining, compromise. This is the essence. And this is actually under assault, which is worrying, particularly for me. So I'm not so much concerned about simple solutions to deal with these economic problems or migration or security. No, those things we have to deliberate, we have to bargain, we have to argue. Because there is no one way of fixing those things. And we will make mistakes as we go along. But we are abandoning reforms. I always, my major field is European Union. When there was last reform? After the fiasco of European Constitution. Unless you believe that electing Mr. Juncker as a Spitzenkandidat was a triumph of democracy.
I think that's a good point. How can you remodel international organizations to give people back some of the direct influence in those systems?
That's a great and a big question. It requires a long answer, but I will be very short because we want to open it also, right? And therefore, I try to give a very brief answer, and that then gives maybe the chance to open the discussion. My basic sense is we need to insert something like political competition within international institutions. The basic problem, and in that sense, I'm maybe more pro-Juncker than you are. The basic problem that I see, if someone does not like, for example, European policy, the only way to essentially, besides loyalty, to go back to Hirschman, the only way to express this is to be against the EU. And that is something deadly for any powerful, authoritative institution in the long term. In that sense, it's important to establish and institutionalize political competition within the EU and within international institutions in order essentially to make the decision-making more public, in order to allow for the struggles between different values, and that produce then compromises. And that would be, the very short answer, essentially, to say we need to have this sort of competition, and therefore the Spitzenkandidat is one step, a little step. The decisive thing, of course, is that the Spitzenkandidat has an important role in establishing certain policies, and that people know before for which kind of policy which Spitzenkandidat stands for. And that was clearly not the case when Juncker and Schulz.
We knew what policies he stands for. He is a symbol of tax dodging in Europe. So we knew this. I'm sorry. We all knew this.
Okay, let's agree to disagree and open it up to your questions. Yes. And could you introduce yourselves, please?
I'm Torsten Benner with GPPI, a think tank here in Berlin. Mr. Zielonka, I have a couple of points for you because I found your presentation, your hypothesis fascinating. First of all, I'd like you, because you went to Italy, to Hungary, and all the problem cases, what do you make of the developments in Portugal and Spain? I find that very interesting because these are countries that have been, you would agree, hardest hit by some of the economic imbalances that you've described, but they haven't shown all the reactions. You can point to Podemos as a populist force, but then I can point to Ciudadanos as a more kind of centrist new type of force. And there's very little extremism in both countries. So how do you explain that? It doesn't quite fit your model. And I like to use liberal in the term of liberal democracy, but you've consistently talked about liberals now as if they were the most central force in European politics over the past decades. And they're not. The most central forces in Western Europe, at least, are Christian Democrats and Social Democrats. In this country, we still have a somewhat sizable Social Democratic party and a big Christian Democratic party. And it's not too late to talk about parties and how to reinvent them. And you've talked very little about parties. You've talked about all sorts of reinvention of this and that and going to the internet. They should go on the internet, yes, for sure. But I like your thoughts on these political forces and the parties that have sustained liberal democracy and built Europe, that are not dead in all countries. And the third is more on the politics of identity and migration. Because on the one hand, I didn't quite get what you were saying on, yes, we need a new narrative of us and a sense of community, but then you seem to descend into communitarianism in terms of less individual rights and more group rights, which I find very dangerous for building this narrative of us. And then you didn't, I didn't quite get what your normative stance was on migration, because you were all railing against Rutte for kind of adopting some of the more hardline positions, but he's still a liberal Democrat and he's not an extremist, and I don't mind having in power. And if Hungary is to be reconquered from the liberal state project, it will be somebody like Mr. Rutte with some other kind of social policies who will win this back, not some left-wing project necessarily. So I didn't quite get that sense of where you draw the line. You can accuse liberals of hypocrisy for shutting out those in need, but in order to save the kind of liberal project at home, where do you draw the line, and what is in the realm of acceptable for you?
Yes, but you could answer. Those were actually 4 questions, but please go ahead and answer.
Well, I'll be brief. I wouldn't put Portugal and Spain to the same basket. Well, I think Portugal shows some ability to have a consensual government between different countries, and we can discuss why it is so. I'm very worried about Spain and the way Rajoy behaves these days. I find it absolutely authoritarian, and since he doesn't have majority, I understand why he's playing on this nationalist tune. This doesn't mean that I have sympathy for nationalists also on the regional basis, but I find simply policies of the current Spanish government extremely problematic. Yeah? And if this is the example of consensual politics you mentioned, thank you very much. Yeah? Now, about this country, I would be, I cannot talk about this country because you know it much better, but I thought you had elections which shocked some observers nevertheless. But it's for you to evaluate the meaning of this in the long run. What I want to say is that you see, all of those things played out themselves in a local context. Because of course, if country grew 25% in the last decade, like Poland, they have different problems like countries which basically shrunk 25% like Greece. What I want to say is that because of growing discrepancies, it is much more difficult to make an arrangement across Europe. Because when some decade ago, Germany, or maybe even more, 12 years ago, Germany and Spain had the same unemployment level, 12%, it was much easier to make an arrangement, for instance, on social policy and economic policy than now, when the unemployment in Spain is how much? 4 or 5 times higher. So those are things, they are given. It is not very easy to get out of this, because creditors never wanted debtors to tell what they should do with their money. And I see it not so much in Germany pronounced, but in countries like Holland and Finland, very assertive language. Rutte already said to Macron, don't tell me what we are doing with our money. And so those things, why it has, have we fixed certain problems on convergence, on migration, on inequalities area, it would be easier to solve them, because none of those problems is easy to solve. And here's my sentence on migration. I mean, migration is as long, as old as humanity. Just read the Bible. It is never, it was always conflictual, but it always happened. Now, and there is no one way to deal with migration. And we can argue, looking at statistics, whether even this last wave of migration was most historically pronounced. For Germany, maybe yes, but certainly not for countries like Britain or France, who hardly took any migrants. I'm not even talking about Poland, right? But the truth is that the handling of migration hasn't been anything but successful, because migration requires, to handle migration, you have to deal with aid policy, you have to deal with governance system in countries which are underdeveloped, you have to deal with colonial legacies, you have to you have to have security policy. You also need to have registration and normal policies. You need to have variety of instruments to deal with migration, and most of them produce effects, hopefully positive, of a decade or two. So there is no one simple way to deal with those problems. Yeah? And yet decisions have to be made. What I want to say is that we consistently try to argue that we basically don't have a problem. We we ask military ships in Mediterranean to chase traffickers, and we paid some autocrats to keep controls on the shores, and thought that this is it. Like now today, we are made to believe that the deal with Erdogan will last. Good luck, eh?
More questions? Yes, please.
Thanks for the presentation. Sasan Goliaga, VZB. Sort of quick one for Michael. So you said at the beginning that there's sort of a tension between having to change the liberal institution or the liberal order in order to defend it, right? My question would be, is there an alternative between changing the liberal order to defend it or abandoning it? That is there a way we can actually reform global governance or world politics or whatever term you prefer by expanding whatever order that is beyond sort of a Western liberal concept? Is there a way we can be more inclusive while at the same time not giving up certain liberal or Western, or however you want to term them, values? Is there via media in a way between the revolution and the defense of the liberal order?
Directly? I mean, clearly, when I say I want to have political competition in international institutions, it involves the possibility that the result of this competition are policies that I do not like. That's something which is always a danger when you go this way. And that essentially means, yes, you need to be inclusive in terms of the political process in order to create the legitimacy that is needed for those institutions to function. And then you can ask the question, do we need those institutions? And I would say yes, in a world of globalization, there are just a set of collective problems on the global level which need to be handled beyond the national level. And therefore, the task is essentially to strengthen the legitimacy of those institutions. But let me just go back to this example that I mentioned. I still would argue, and in that sense I'm probably a liberal that will stick to liberalism for all the time. But I mean, to some extent I make the argument it's the failure of liberalism to live up to its own ideals that has produced the legitimacy crisis in which we live. When I use the example of like cases are not treated alike in terms of interventions, I mean, the basic idea of rule of law, alike cases should be treated alike. These are liberal principles. And it's the failure, essentially, to deliver or to live along and in line with these principles that has, to some extent, or to a significant extent, I would argue, produced the legitimacy crisis of international institutions. But let me say one word. I mean, just not to be too negative about those things. I mean, it's absolutely right. We failed in our development policy for decades, and therefore we shouldn't wonder about migration. But then again, I mean, if we really take the perspective of a global society, if we look to the world society as a whole, and if we look for the last 25 years, it's not that everything has been bad. In the last 25 years, the Human Development Index, the overall Human Development Index went up so steeply than never before in history. In the last 25 years, the global inequality went down as steeply as never before in history. I mean, the fact that many people in India and China and so on earn now much more money than 25 years ago, that has to be seen. In that sense, I mean, if we talk about global poverty, about the reasons for migration, there has been done much too little, I agree. But then again, globalization and the liberalism of the last 25 years produced some outcomes on the level of the world society which are historically unique. And I'm just repeating, the Human Development Index and the global Gini, two indicators, changed so fundamentally in the last 25 years than never before in history since we have those kind of indicators. So that is to some extent also the puzzle that we have essentially a liberal order that has been created on the global level in the 1990s, that has delivered quite something, and nevertheless it's now under fire.
There was a question over there too.
Yes, I also want to relate to Jan's points. I agree with many single analysis, and as you know, I'm in history. But I wonder what the periods of reference are in your implicitly and explicitly comparative argument. I mean, since you stress so much the new challenges and even the structural change of the system, you implicitly compare with another period. And I think you should be clearer on that. If you compare with the dreams of, let's say, Dahrendorf after 1990. I fully understand that disappointment is a major reaction now, or Fukuyama, end of history, even more. And Dahrendorf had also some more realistic dimensions in his arguments, I would say. But of course, this hope that now wars would end, Europe would be united, and it will be a new dominance of freedom and liberty, this has not turned true. And partly you seem to compare with this normative vision. If you compare with the 4 decades between 1950 and 1990, I wonder whether you have a tendency to play down the conflicts and the deficiencies of this time. I mean, after all, this was not a period where liberal ideals were unquestioned and dominant. You had wars. When you lived through, you know that intellectuals were around who predicted the explosion of the system, or the Unregierbarkeit des Systems, the ungovernability of the system. And you had a lot of repression, suppression in Europe, and etc. I mean, and one cannot say, as you said, that this was a period when change was only piecemeal and under control. That's what you said in the part of your oral presentation, which I got. Was it really? Who controlled? Who was in control of this system? And certainly the governments were not in control of markets. And it was not the golden age of liberalism between. And if you compare, of course, with the interwar period, with the first part of the 20th century, I mean, it was much worse then. And that was really a crisis situation. So it seems to me what is normality is, I would have a more skeptical point of view on the whole period. And as a consequence, I would not be that alarmed about the present situation. Also, of course, you could also point to some success stories within the last 20, 25 years. In the year 2008, many of us, historians, economic historians, feared that there would be a repetition of the big crisis of 1929, 1930. This was avoided. A few years later, in the Euro crisis, many economists and others predicted the breakdown of the European Union due to the, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy. It hasn't happened so far. And a few other things. Inequality also did not unilaterally increase, as Michael Zürn just said it. If you take a global perspective, it looks different. But even if you look on the West, even if you look to Germany, there's a new book by Hartmut Kelble, social historians, Mehr Armut, mehr Reichtum. It's much more complicated than what Piketty says. There are dimensions of inequality which have not grown. So take it all together. It seems to me that you need more sense of proportion for evaluating the present situation, although I agree very much with the partial analysis of yours.
Would you like to reply? Or so what's normality? What's your... Make it short.
I never contradict Jürgen Kocher, so especially in this building. But you see, you contradicted yourself a little bit. Because if there were those successes in recent years, then there is a difference, that there are those benchmarks. And my wife is historian. She constantly told me, where is your starting point of liberalism? Neoliberal economics started before '89. So I struggle with periodization too, right? In Western Europe, liberalism began to triumph much earlier than Central Eastern Europe. The only reason for this periodization was exactly Dahrendorf. And in a way, it was a crowning of the project. Europe became liberal as a whole. Although many people at the time said it would be not possible. I remember Przeworski, in America writing about in 1990, that there will be impossible to have market reforms and democracy at the same time. Klaus had a polemic with him, so he remembers. Of course. And it is, as you know, easier to look from historical perspective than to look into the future, because we don't know. The only thing we know about the future is that we get usually little value for money for those people who predict the future. I don't know what the future will bring, but I don't want to be complacent. I believe that there were a lot of good things happening. Take European integration. For many years, it was this EU had a sex appeal. Everybody wanted to be like us. It's no longer like this. Something went wrong, right? The same about the model of democracy. Everybody thought that the way we run democracy with constitutional liberalism, to make long story short, is the best way to run countries, because these democrats maybe are not more peaceful, but they are certainly economically prosperous. It proved to be otherwise. So I see those trends, and this is an essay and reflection. This is not so ambitious project as the one of Michael. So I simply cannot say anything else. But like this American saying, if this object looks like a duck, speaks like a duck, and walks like a duck, must be a duck, So we sense something, you know what I mean? We sense something that there is there. And of course, my major problem with liberals is that they try to minimize this. They say, no, first of all, we've done such a terrific job. Why do you criticize us? Yes, we've made mistakes, but we did a terrific job. Then, they lose elections and they say, yeah, how is it possible? I mean, I live in Britain. People cannot understand how is it possible that majority voted Brexit. They're in a shock.
So maybe shock should be the last word of this evening. And I'd like to finish it here. If you have more questions, you can come up and ask them in a one-on-one, and the rest of us can get out of here and have some of that beautiful summer evening in April, and think about some more about the end of the liberal global order and all the good arguments that still stand against it. Thank you all very much for coming, also in the name of Michael Zürn and Jan Zielonka, and have a pleasant evening.
Let me just add, there are some drinks and pretzels outside, so if you want to have something before you go to the beer garden, do it.